I'm Carmine Gallo, and this is What the Speak podcast.
What the Speak, episode 24. All right, here we go. Joe, the intro.
Do you kick ass when you speak, present, or pitch? If not, these expert discussions and insider tips can help you right now, today. Welcome to the What the Speak podcast. I'm your host, Brian Kelly.
If you've never seen the story behind how and why the What the Speak podcast got started, visit whatthespeak.com/speakbetter to watch the 90-second video. If you like what you see, send the link to someone you know. Carmine Gallo, are you ready to answer the question, what the speak?
Absolutely. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, Carmine, you're a keynote speaker. You're a communications coach for some of the world's most admired brands. You're also the best-selling author of books like The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, which is a personal favorite of mine.
Thanks.
Plus, you have a new book coming out titled Talk Like Ted. But let's hear it directly from you. Can you briefly tell us about yourself and what you do?
Well, you're right. I am a communications coach, which means that I work with executives for brands and products that touch your life every single day. And that makes me very fortunate to be able to be working with executives who make products that improve your life in some way every single day. In fact, if I was there in your office with you, I could probably point out several electronics gadgets and devices and even components inside those computers that you're using that are produced by the executives who I work with. And what I do, Brian, is I help them take that product and craft and deliver the best messages, ideas, presentations that really communicate the story behind those products. So that's essentially what I do day to day. I do a lot of keynote speaking for sales groups or associations, and I write. And I'm a trained journalist. So I went to Northwestern. I worked at CNN. I love writing, still love journalism, and I've discovered different platforms in which to educate people. I can learn things and then educate people like yourself. So I write for Forbes and I write books, which is a particular passion of mine.
Excellent. So what are the specific topics, or maybe there's one topic in general that you deliver when you present to a group of people?
Well, it always falls under the category of communication. And that can be communicating in a PowerPoint presentation. How do you pitch yourself in a PowerPoint? How do you deliver an elevator pitch? How do you craft a message around a very complicated new product or a new service or company that you're launching? But also communication. I've written a couple of books on customer service because when you walk into an Apple store, for example, it's all communication. It's not just the product, it's how employees are taught to communicate with you. So I find that for individuals especially, I think the single greatest skill that can help people really accomplish their dreams and succeed in this new information age is the ability to communicate persuasively. So that's what I teach. How to communicate better. And that's what I study. That's what I learn. That's what I'm obsessed about. My obsession is communication. How do we communicate our ideas more persuasively?
Well, I have to say, I've seen you give a keynote presentation. I think it was sometime last year at a conference, and I was a fan when I read your book, the Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, and then being able to see you deliver that in such a fantastic way. Was quite an experience.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. It's always a little nerve-wracking when they introduce you as a speaker and they introduce you by saying he's the author of The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs. It sort of raises the bar a little bit.
Yes.
So you had better be good if you wrote a book with that title.
Yeah, well, I know I did an interview with Nancy Duarte a little while back, and we talked about that very thing. She said her nerves going into her delivery of the TED Talk that she gave.
Oh, yeah.
She was freaking out because she's like, I'm the presentation lady.
Yes.
So it's got to be good. Well, Carmine, let's shift the focus a little bit. I want to move to the part of our discussion where we talk about your origin story. I'd love to dive into the history, your background. How did you get into public speaking and ultimately professional speaking?
I was a journalist. I was trained as a broadcast journalism major at Northwestern. So I went to Medill at Northwestern and went through Journalism 101. Got a master's degree in that, and then started working for a number of different local networks. And then I went to CNN. I actually worked as a financial reporter. Lou Dobbs hired me in New York. Mm-hmm. So I moved from California and I worked at CNN for a while. And so I was bitten by the journalism bug early. But then things started to change. As you know, things change in journalism quite dramatically. That didn't seem to be a great career path anymore. But also what changed is I really wanted to learn about the business side of things. I didn't want to just cover great companies. I wanted to somehow participate in their growth. I didn't know how to do that. I was just thinking about it. And what happened, and I'll never forget this at CNN, there were a few people. There's always a few spokespeople, whether it's an economist or a business leader, who we used to interview all the time. A handful of people. 10 years later, those same people are the ones that you still see on TV. Right. What's the difference? The difference was not that they were the most expert in a particular topic. The difference was that they were better communicators. They were more interesting and engaging and enlightening and not complicated. They made things simple. So I started doing what's called media training, and that's actually how I started my own practice. I still do a fair amount of it, but less so. Media training is when you work directly with executives to help them tell their story to the media. And then after that, I started to realize, wow, there's a lot more to this because I can take everything I learned in journalism school and at CNN and as a broadcast journalist and apply it to the business world. So I started working with pre-IPO companies, for example, that were going public, getting them ready for their roadshow. How do you tell the story? And that's what I do today. And I just work with a wide range of companies in every field, and there's something different every week. But it all comes down to how are we going to tell our story persuasively?
Yeah. So when you were first getting started, let's maybe go back to journalism school.
Yeah.
Was there one thing in particular that you struggled with, and how did you overcome it? To be the polished speaker that you are today, what was something that you struggled with, or maybe was there something that you still struggle with?
Well, I'm glad you said I'm a polished speaker. That takes work. Great public speaking takes a lot of work. Yeah. Many, many years of practice. Obviously, I've written about Steve Jobs, and many people will tell me I'm not like Steve Jobs. People will say, "Oh, I'm not as inspiring. I'm not as charismatic as Steve Jobs." Well, neither was he in the 1970s when he was a young man. There's old video clips on YouTube. He was not polished. Right. Not a great speaker. He was very nervous about public speaking. So if you look back at some of my old, reels, the tapes that we used to use back then when I was at CNN. The guy was okay, but it took me many years of practice and always applying myself and trying to learn how I could become a better public speaker. And you do that by watching people, by emulating people, great speakers, and also by studying the craft and practicing as much as you can. Yeah. Also, you got to be humble, Brian. You've got to be humble. The worst public speakers, and this is, I don't quite understand the psychology behind it, but it's absolutely true. I know it to be a fact because I've been doing this for 25 years since I was in college. I've noticed this. Yep. I have noticed that the worst speakers, the worst people, the ones who are boring and dry and confusing and convoluted, they are the ones who always say, "Oh, I'm really good at public speaking because I do it all the time. I'm really good at it." We used to have a joke. When I was working in TV, we had a joke. When people said they didn't want to be prepared, they didn't need to be prepared, they're on TV all the time, they were the worst. Yeah. Those were the people who were never invited back. There were a few folks, though, who were really good, And they always ask for my feedback afterwards. Hey, how was that, Carmine? Did I do well? Yeah, you actually did great. Why are you even asking? You did fantastic. But and it is true. The people who are a little more humble, who are always looking to improve, don't think they're that good. But they're typically better than average. The minute you start finding people who say, "Oh, I don't need any work. I'm a really good speaker," almost inevitably they will be worse than average.
I understand.
Don't ask me to interpret the psychology behind it. It just, that's the case. I'm telling you.
It's a fact. So with you, obviously, when you started in school, there were the struggles of just kind of getting that, I guess, development or sharpening those skills.
Right.
Was there anything that you can recall, stuttering over your words, getting nervous, anything in particular that you could share with us?
Well, certainly when I wasn't as prepared, I did learn that preparation does help reduce nerves in a big way, which is why I'm a big advocate of practice. A lot of practice. When you know what you're going to say, how you're going to begin a slideshow, how you're going to end your presentation, gives you a lot of practice. I mean, it gives you a lot of confidence. Yeah, certainly when I was just thrown into the fires, and sometimes there were fires, right? When I was in local news, you could start covering it. The nerves would creep up. It's like, well, I'm not even sure what I'm going to say here. But when I had time to prepare, and I knew exactly what I was going to say and how I was going to answer the tough questions that were going to come at me, had a lot more confidence and energy and excitement. So practice is something that I learned early on, that you really need to practice. Most people don't practice a presentation. They just don't.
Yeah.
They create some slides, they glance at it once or twice. They don't really practice the way they should, actually pretending to give it in front of a group. But the other thing about that, the other thing I learned at Northwestern, I'll never forget this. This is a great story. My instructor at the time was a tough Italian guy. Now, I'm Italian too, so I'm okay with a lot of yelling and screaming. But he was a tough Italian, and I'll never forget, I went on assignment, right? The assignment, and then I came back and I said, "Oh, there was no story there. There was no story." And he yelled at me. I mean, you could just see the blood vessels. He said, "Gallo, there's always a story." And I'll never forget that. That's true. There's always a story. So that I still apply that today. You can take anything. You can take any product or an idea or a company, and there's a great story there. You just have to be able to find the story and tell that story in a way that's engaging.
Yep. Great. Well, Carmine, let's now shift to getting some of your insights from your expert perspective.
Okay.
And the first question for this portion of our discussion that I'd like to focus in on is really talking about, why is it so important today to be able to inspire, motivate, and persuade audiences when you speak and present?
There's a neuroscientist by the name of Gregory Burns. He teaches at Emory University. He wrote a wonderful book called Iconoclast. But it's a book about innovators and people who think differently, sort of the creative class. And he talks about communication. And there's one line in the book that I use all the time in my keynotes. A person can have the greatest idea in the world. If that person cannot convince enough other people, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
And that I find to be very, very true. I cannot tell you how many times I've been called in personally to different companies by a boss or the head of HR who wanted me to work with a particular executive whose job was literally on the line. Why? Because that executive just did not inspire leadership. They just didn't come across as confident and as inspiring. And after I worked with these executives, I realized it's all about how they're communicating, or even body language. A lot of people had great messages, just bad body language that made them look, vulnerable or not as confident as they should be. I'll never forget walking. I did a communication workshop for a very large technology company, group of engineers at this one company. It's a company that is probably right there in your office. You don't even know it, but it's right there in front of you. And I'll never forget, during the lunch break, the head of this particular division pulled me aside, pointed it through the window, the door, pointed to some guy in the front row, and he said, "Carmine, you see that guy? He's the smartest guy in the room. Here's the part I remember. He's the smartest guy in the room. He should be running this company by now." I said, "Well, why isn't he?" "Because he can't communicate to save his life. He can't give a presentation to save his life. He's complicated and boring, and it's very hard to follow him and his logic. He's just not a great communicator." So I think there's a lot of that around everywhere in the world. There are people who should be running the company, but they're not, because they're not communicating persuasively. I've got a great story. I just heard this a couple of weeks ago. Somebody called me. They had read Presentation Secrets, and they read some of my Forbes articles. They're applying everything. This particular gentleman is a manager at a huge global tech company. Over the last 2 years, they've tapped him as an evangelist. They now send him all over the world to speak to customers. Even when account directors in those particular countries could be doing it, they actually have asked this guy, this particular man, to give the presentations because he gives a better presentation. And I said, "What does that mean to you professionally?" And the person responded, "Out of a company of 80,000 people, I get noticed. And I'm climbing the ranks a lot faster than I would have." It all comes down to being a good speaker, being a good communicator.
Yeah. So that makes complete sense for those that are in the corporate world. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts for, maybe it's entrepreneurs, maybe it's, folks who are utilizing a lot of the new media that's out there today with all the technological advances? Why is communicating so important for those that maybe we're not executives at big corporations, but we need to be able to convey our ideas?
Oh, most of the people who I am asked to address, I mean, look, let's be honest. Most people who hire me are going to be the executives for some of the big companies. That's why I write and I try to speak at conferences where I reach a lot of the younger people. In fact, just yesterday, I was at Evernote, which is a very hot technology company near San Francisco. They were all 20-somethings and a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience. The point of doing those things is because they're always pitching themselves. Daniel Pink came out with a wonderful new book called "To Sell is Human." And he said, we are all in sales now. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. So as a young person, you're pitching yourself constantly in interviews, in your career, and certainly to get funding. If you want to get funding from seed investors or angel investors, you'd better be able to tell a good story and express your passion. Not too long ago, I heard from a young college graduate, went to one of the UCs here in California, and had heard all these horror stories about how hard it was for his friends and people his age to get a job. He landed a job on his third interview in San Francisco at a hot startup. And he credited a lot of what he had learned from just reading my stuff and just becoming a better communicator. And he said, "Carmine, I practiced for the interview just like I would a presentation." And I walked into, here's what he said. He said, "I walked into that interview knowing their product and their elevator pitch better than most of the people who work there." And here's what they said. This is really fascinating. They said that this young man did such a good job of pitching their product, they wanted to record him so the salespeople could watch him. So how did he get that job, Brian? He got that job by being a little better as a communicator.
I love it.
It's everything.
Great
communication is everything.
I couldn't agree more, Carmine. All right.
What to speak, of course.
What to speak. So the other thing I did want to ask you, since I've got you here, is you've got this new book coming out, Talk Like TED.
Yes.
What's one of the biggest takeaways from the content that's in that book that you can share with us right now?
I have about 50 different takeaways, but I'll give you one. Tell a story. Tell a story. There was a man named Brian Stevenson. Here's another Brian. And in fact, if you go to TED.com, I would urge all of your viewers, watch this guy. He's fantastic. His name is Brian Stevenson, common spelling. He is a very famous attorney. He actually wins cases in front of the Supreme Court. So he's pretty sharp.
Yeah.
So he's pretty skilled as a orator and as a communicator. He gave a presentation at TED, and he received at TED 2013, and he received the longest standing ovation of any TED Talk. And if you and I spoke to him afterwards, if you break down how he did it, 65% of that 20-minute TED Talk, or 18 minutes that he spoke, it was stories. He told 3 stories. He used data, he used facts to support his theme, but it was stories that connect him to the audience. He delivers very controversial topics. He is a lawyer for, he tries to get young people out of prison, people who are unfairly, targeted, unfairly put in prison. That doesn't go over great with a lot of communities, as you would imagine. So he said, I've got to connect with people. I need to get people to like me right out of the gate. And how do I do that? I tell stories. So he told 3 stories. 65% of his presentation are personal stories. One about his grandmother, one about meeting Rosa Parks, which was a big event in his life, and one story about a particular janitor that he had met when he was in court one day, and what that relationship meant. So just really simple stories. And I asked him, Brian, why did you start with a story about your grandmother? He said, Carmine, everybody has a grandmother. So everyone's got, it's like, what can I do to make a connection with you?
Yeah, common ground.
Yeah. Every great TED presentation, every single one that goes viral, and those are the ones I really try to focus on, the ones that get like 10 or 15 million views, they all tell stories. They all start with stories. They all tell stories. And yet in business today, very few people tell stories. It's much more formal. I'm giving a PowerPoint presentation now, so I must make it really boring. People don't tell personal stories or personal anecdotes, or even telling the story behind a product. How did a product come to be? How did it come to pass? You can tell stories about products. You can tell stories about yourself. You can tell stories about people you've met. You can tell stories about customers. But stories are emotional. Stories connect with people.
Perfect. That is a great tip. And we look forward to reading the book and all those other 49 takeaways that you've got in there.
Yeah, I think people will like it because I spent many months researching the science behind why things work. Yeah. So it wasn't just the fact that all TED Talks are 18 minutes. No, I wanted to dive into why 18 minutes. Why does that work better than 60 minutes? Yep. And there's science behind it. I've actually spoken to researchers and scientists and neuroscience who study this stuff. So that was the fun part.
Great. Well, Carmine, to round out our discussion, we want to move into the rapid fire Q&A session. So are you ready?
Yes, I am. Okay, I was ready for this.
The first question is, do you prefer slides or no slides?
Slides.
Why?
Slides complement the narrative. We're a visual society. We're a multimedia generation. We communicate in video and photographs and Instagram. And why not use slides? But not traditional PowerPoint slides full of text and bullet points. I'm talking visuals, pictures, and images.
Great. Okay, next question is, who is a speaker that inspires you the most and why? And I could probably guess this, but I want to hear your answer.
Okay. Let's see. Steve Jobs. A blog, because I've written a book on Steve Jobs and I write a lot about Steve Jobs, a blogger once asked me, or he observed, he goes, "You're really obsessed with Steve Jobs." And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, actually, no, I'm not necessarily obsessed with him. I'm obsessed with great communication. And he had the whole package, Brian. I'm still trying to find the package. It's tough. He had the whole package. He had charisma, passion, visually, beautifully engaging slides, told a story, practiced the heck out of his presentations, introduced problems and solutions, could convince you in 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, he convinced us to, instead of getting music for free, that we should pay 99 cents a song. The iTunes presentation was 10 minutes. He completely changed the way you look at the world, all in one presentation. And he did that time and time and time again. So to me, he's the number one presenter. But I do like a lot of other people who I've met, especially ones who are authentic and engaging. I interviewed Richard Branson earlier this year for my Forbes column. And he is one-on-one the most friendliest, most engaging personality I've ever met.
Great. All right. So next question is, what's the funniest thing that's happened to you when giving a presentation?
When giving a presentation? Oh, that's a good one. Well, the nice thing is that not too many unexpected things happen because I practice so well. So I'm pretty much, practiced or rehearsed for anything that might happen. I think it's just, that's a tough one. The funniest thing that's ever happened. Yeah.
Did anybody do something crazy in the audience that maybe threw you for just a couple of seconds?
Yeah, I think it's more along the lines, Brian, of just kind of many inspiring things have happened. Not so much funny, but very inspiring things have happened. Where I've called somebody in the audience to maybe help me understand a particular company. And I remember one person got up and gave one of the most inspired pitches for this particular company. All of the executives in the room stood up. We all stood up and gave her this round of applause. And it turned out that she was actually one of the office assistants. She wasn't even one of the top executives, and yet could articulate why that company exists and why it's so important to the people. And yet the executives had never identified her. So again, it's all about finding those little gems of things that happen in a particular talk. So I love finding gems. They're not always funny, but they're always insightful gems where something will just come together or will come up with a new way of explaining a particular product or a company or a topic, and everybody's jaw will drop. And they'll say, wow, why haven't we been talking about? That's right. Our company is so much more than this particular product. And so when you get those light bulb moments, I think those are the coolest moments to get.
I like that. All right. So now I want to ask you, what really, you teach people how to communicate, but for you personally, what kind of impact has being a speaker had on your career?
Everything. It's everything. Because I have now been able to translate what I did as a journalist to a completely new career. I don't consider myself a journalist. I consider myself an entrepreneur. I consider myself a storyteller. But there's still all of the skills that I learned when I was, in college, reading famous speeches. So I was able to take my passion. I had this. I was such a nerd in college. I was a communication nerd at UCLA. I would go to the library. I remember the law library had vital speeches of the day, and it was a monthly pamphlet that had the most famous speeches of the day every month. Right? It was called Vital Speeches of the Day. I was such a nerd. I would read that stuff. I was able to take my passion for communicating ideas, transfer it into a career of journalism, and then take that journalism career and transfer it into building my own company. And as you know, when you have your own company, I mean, nothing beats that. It's like you're not even working every day. It's just a joy to do what you're doing every day. So for me, communication, public speaking, it's everything. It's all tied together. It's all one. The work and play is all one now.
Great answer. All right, the last question is, what advice do you wish you had received when you first started speaking? Now, obviously, you went through some specific training, through your studies in journalism. But looking back, what's the one thing that you know now that you wish somebody would have given you at that beginning stage?
Well, even if they had given this piece of advice to me, I'm not sure if I would have taken it seriously. You got to look at yourself as a brand. You are the brand. If you allow the corporation, to label you, and if your identity is affixed to the corporation or the organization that you're with, it's really hard to break out for yourself as a brand. So I worked for a lot of big companies, so I was always associated with those companies. And it's only since I started my own firm that I look at myself, I'm the brand, and you need to treat yourself as a brand. Apple is a brand that's important to Apple. You're just as important to Apple for yourself. You're a brand. So the way you speak, the way you communicate, the way you create your website, how you interact with people on Facebook and Twitter and other social media, it should reflect you as a brand. Where do you want to take yourself as a brand? You're the brand. A lot of young people don't quite see themselves as a brand yet. It's, they are more associated. They see themselves as associated with whatever organization they're under.
Yeah.
But you're the brand. And especially nowadays, because jobs come and go, right? So you always have to have that underlying brand in place.
Got it. All right. Well, Carmine, we'll have all the links to your website, your books, your social media profiles, and other resources in the show notes over at whattospeak.com. I want to deeply and sincerely thank you for sharing your time, your expertise, and your insight into the story of your personal journey as someone who truly kicks ass when they speak, present, or pitch.
I love that. I love that. I think everybody needs to kick ass when they present or pitch.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carmine.
Thanks for inviting me.
You bet. Today's guest certainly had some amazing insights they shared. If you'd like to purchase a copy of their latest book, visit this episode's show notes over at whattospeak.com and click the link at the bottom of the page to immediately order their book.
All right, here we go with the outro.
Thanks so much for joining us today on What to Speak. Be sure to visit whattospeak.com for show notes on every episode and to sign up for our email list to stay updated on resources that'll help you kick ass when you speak, present, or pitch.